Both. Yeah. All right. So, welcome everyone to this PCC forum. Before I introduce our guest, I want to play a short video clip and I'll explain the context afterwards. This is Frank Sinatra, I'll give you that much. And it's from the late stages of World War II. Can everyone see that? Yeah. Can everyone hear it?
Use your good American heads.
Yeah, good.
Don't let anybody make suckers out of you. Well, gotta go to work.
What do you work?
I sing.
Ah, you're a kid.
Come here. Now you all stand here, and no hissing allowed.
What is America to me? A name, a map, or a flag I see? A certain word, democracy. What is America to me? A house I live in, a plot of earth, a street, the grocer and the butcher, and the people that I meet, the children in the playground, the faces that I see, all races and religions, that's America to me. The place I work in, the worker at my side, the little town or city where my people lived and died, the howdy and the handshake, the air of feeling free, and the right to speak my mind out, that's America to me.
All right. So I thought it would be appropriate to begin our forum tonight with this song by Frank Sinatra, which, as I said, was written and recorded at the end of World War II. Frank Sinatra is singing it there. It was actually, the lyrics were written by Abel Meeropol, who you may know as a blacklisted Jewish communist. He wrote the song Strange Fruit, and he also wrote this song under the pseudonym Lewis Allen. And this is the song that our guest tonight, Seth Zuihō Segall, chose for the title of his book. Let me also spotlight myself here. Here we go. So Seth, welcome. Let me introduce you here so everybody knows who you are. Seth is a Zen Buddhist priest and a retired clinical psychologist. He served on the clinical faculty of the Yale University School of Medicine for 3 decades. He's a contributing editor to the magazine Tricycle, a review editor for the Humanistic Psychologist, a science writer for Mindfulness Research Monthly, and he teaches at Pamsula Zen of Westchester and the New York Insight Meditation Society. He's also the author of a couple of other books before the house we live in, Virtue, Wisdom, and Pluralism, which we'll be talking about tonight. His earlier books include Encountering Buddhism, Western Psychology and Buddhist Teachings, published in 2003, Buddhism and Human Flourishing, A Modern Western Perspective, published in 2020, and Living Zen, A Practical Guide to a Balanced Existence, and others. Seth, such a pleasure to have you join us tonight.
It's good to be here. Should we also mention that we're related?
Yes, Seth is my cousin, as you may have been wondering. But we don't talk much, actually. And so this is a real treat to be in dialogue with you about these shared interests. I certainly share an interest in virtue ethics, but I think all of us, whether we are Americans or not, have an interest in democracy and the sort of inquiry into moral values and virtue that you engage in this book. So to get things started, I mean, first of all, just a few words about this video I just showed. I was going to play the song, and Seth let me know there's actually a video. This is obviously a piece of World War II propaganda, right? Speaking to the aspirations of a multicultural American democracy at a time when the US and its allies were fighting against fascism in Europe. Obviously, it's aspirational in the sense that there was and continues to be still some issues internal to the United States, racism chief among them. And so even though, we were fighting against the Nazis, we have these issues at home, and the American dream continues to be a work in progress, right? And your book is, I think, in service of that dream. I get the sense that you wrote this in the wake of the election of Donald Trump, and that was the main motivation. Is that true?
That's fair. I've always been, I don't think I've ever been blind to the problems in this country. I mean, I was active in the civil rights movement in the 60s and active in Students for Democratic Society back in the late 60s too. I organized some of the first demonstrations against the Vietnam War and demonstrated against the Iraq War and so forth. I've been involved in protecting immigrants in my local community, working with the police department, to make sure that they didn't ask people their nationality or whether they had documents or not. So I've always been aware of the many problems that we have, but I didn't think I was really aware until 2016 about how bad things could get. And there was a way in which I found the election of Donald Trump to be shocking. And then the more I thought about it, the more I realized it shouldn't have been shocking, that there are forces supporting Donald Trump that have always been around, whether you're looking at the Dixiecrats, in the South and in the Jim Crow South, and people like George Wallace in the past, or Huey Long, or Father Clarkland, or Charles Lindbergh, Henry Ford. I mean, there's a long tradition that Donald Trump is coming out of. And I think what's different right now is I think democracy is a little bit more fragile than it's been in the past. So that was part of the concern. The other concern was just thinking about the problems that we have as a country that are essentially moral problems more than anything else. If you look at kind of the values that people pursue in their lives, or what they think is going to be fulfilling or enrich them, a lot of people are pursuing values that are really fairly empty or don't really lead to any kind of fulfillment. And we're seeing this play out in the rates of depression and anxiety and loneliness in adolescents and young adults, or the rates of suicide, alcohol addiction, fentanyl addiction in middle-aged men, for example. You see it in the fact that during the COVID epidemic, Americans died at 10 times the rate that Australians did. There are a lot of signs that we're really in a kind of a very dysfunctional place. And the worst sign of that is the degree of effective polarization between factions in the country, which I think is the worst it's been since the Civil War. I was looking at the rates of intermarriage between Democrats and Republicans, and it's fallen to only maybe about 3% of marriages are intermarriages now between Democrats and Republicans. It was very different 10 years ago. So, I mean, there are a lot of signs that we're kind of coming apart at the seams, or we're not pursuing the right kind of values. And the other thing that occurred to me is that most of the problems that we have are solvable problems. It's not that there aren't solutions to them. It's that we can't find a consensus in this country about what would be the ethical thing to do, that we could all rally around and we could get 51% of the people, or at least 51% of the Congress behind. So, so that's a persistent problem. How in a very polarized society in which we have many different religious and racial and ethnic and political groups that don't necessarily get along together, how do we find a way to compromise on things so that we can actually get things done to make life better for everyone? So that's the impetus for the book, or one of the impetuses for it. And the other impetus is my own journey as a Zen priest, in that um, in one of the books you mentioned I wrote earlier, I was I was somewhat critical of the Buddhist tradition and was trying to compare it with Aristotle and his idea of virtue ethics. And I thought that the Buddhists could learn a thing or two from Aristotle and vice versa, that there was some way of blending these two to come up with a kind of a more um, a more believable religious system for people who are living in late modernity. And as I've been learning Chinese and learning how to read Confucius and Lao Tzu and people like that, I began to realize that the Confucian tradition is another great tradition developed independently from the Greek and Buddhist one, that is also a virtue ethics tradition. And I said, boy, wouldn't it be interesting to kind of compare and contrast all three of them and see what the commonalities might be, and then see if those commonalities could be something we could use in trying to develop a modern ethics, that makes sense to perhaps most people in the United States, not everyone, but maybe most people. So that was the other impetus for the book.
Got it. And yeah, and I want to get into all of that, but before we go there, I want to just invite you to share a bit more about your own biography. So, how did a clinical psychologist at Yale Medical School find his way into the Zen Buddhist priesthood as a carrier and protector of the Dharma?
Well, if I go back to the early 1990s, I watched a television program on PBS back then by Bill Moyers called The Healing of the Mind. And it was in one half-hour segment of that program, he showed a fellow by the name of Jon Kabat-Zinn teaching meditation to people with chronic pain over at the University of Massachusetts Medical Center. And at that time in my clinical practice, I had a lot of chronic pain patients, and I was using hypnosis and biofeedback and different methods to try to kind of reduce pain. And I wasn't too impressed with the results. And when I saw Jon Kabat-Zinn doing that kind of work, it made me flash back to a time in my adolescence when I had been very much influenced by Alan Watts. Alan Watts had come to my school and stayed for a week and gave a series of lectures. And I read everything I could at that point about Buddhism and considered myself a kind of a Buddhist, but I was a book stand Buddhist. I wasn't meditating and I didn't have a teacher. I didn't belong to a community, but still I was very much interested in it. And watching Kabat-Zinn teaching meditation, I said, oh, I know what that's about. I remember that from earlier in my life. So I wanted to go ahead and do an internship over at UMass Medical Center to learn how to do what he was doing. And I found out that before I could do that, I had to at least have 1 year of daily meditation practice of my own, and had to have been on at least one 10-day silent Buddhist meditation retreat at a monastery. So that was my preparation. So I went ahead and did that, did my 10 days in the monastery, went ahead and did my internship over at UMass, and then went around looking for Buddhist teachers. And at that point, there was a conference in Boston, which was the first national conference on Buddhism in America. And so teachers from all over the country were there, and I got to listen to all of them, meet all of them. And I was able to select a couple of people that I wanted to work with and study with in the future. So that was the start of the whole process.
Got it. Well, speaking of Buddhism in America and Buddhism in the West, I wonder if, as a kind of segue into the question of pluralism, which I think we will explore, and you do explore in your book in some depth, and we'll try to surface some of that in our conversation. But the term Buddhist modernism, it's mentioned in this book. You've written about it before. Alan Watts actually referred to Buddhism as Hinduism stripped for export, which is a kind of cheeky way of classing Buddhism among the world religions that have a kind of transcultural reach. And so I wonder, in your view, in what ways is contemporary American Buddhism unique? In what ways is it continuous with this ancient tradition? Or is American Buddhism just too diverse to really make any generalizations about? Or how do you think about this question?
Well, it's a very, I could give you a very lengthy discussion of it, but let's just say that Buddhism starts in India, and then after a time, it doesn't exist in India anymore. It's absorbed into Hinduism, but it travels throughout South Asia and throughout East Asia and Tibet and Mongolia and so forth, and then eventually out to Japan and Korea. So there's a way that every time that it crosses borders, it is encountering indigenous philosophies and religions that already exist in those areas before, and so it enters into dialogue with them and changes. So Chinese Buddhism, for example, is very, very different than Indian Buddhism in a whole variety of ways. Japanese Buddhism is different from Chinese Buddhism and so forth. So as we cross into both different eras and into different countries, we see a constant evolution of the religion, which is not surprising because you see the same evolution in Christianity and Islam and Judaism as well. I mean, if Judaism never changed, we'd still be slaughtering calves at the temple as the main form of worship, right? So, okay, enter into the 1800s, and there's all these Asian countries are subject to Western colonialism. They're encountering the shock of Western philosophy, Western science. They're having Christian missionaries come into the countries and trying to get them to convert to Christianity. And Buddhists in Sri Lanka and in Japan and Burma specifically decided that they wanted to come up with a kind of a modernized Buddhism that they would show that they were just as advanced as Westerners. And they wanted to sell a product that they thought was more rational than Western religion, and in fact was totally compatible with science. That was the argument they made. We call that Buddhist exceptionalism, that somehow out of all the religions in the world, Buddhism is the most compatible with science. And what they did is they changed Buddhism to make it look that way. You know, we can think about the influence of the Kyoto School of Philosophy on Japanese Zen, for example, where they were reading Heidegger and other people and reinterpreting Zen through that kind of lens. So anyway, Buddhism, these people who are Buddhist modernists in Asia bring Buddhism to the West. They come in 1898 to the World Parliament of Religions in Chicago. And all the speakers that come there are Buddhist modernists, and they go ahead and meet a bunch of theosophists in the West, and they begin selling their books, and they begin meeting with psychoanalysts and psychologists. So Jung writes the foreword to D. Suzuki's first book on Zen, or D.T. Suzuki teaches at Columbia University and teaches people like Eric Fromm and Karen Horney and so forth. There's this cross-fertilization that comes about. But what happens in the process is that Buddhism becomes even more modernized. In fact, it becomes naturalized and psychologized by the people in the West who are receiving it. And so a lot of what we call convert Buddhism, in other words, the kind of Buddhism that European descent, mostly European descent people studied when Asian teachers came to the West in the 60s and 70s and 80s. A lot of that ignores a good deal of the Buddhist tradition, jettisons that stuff that doesn't look comfortable anymore. We can forget about rebirth. We can forget about 6 realms of rebirth. We can forget about supernatural powers that you might acquire through meditating and so forth. And let's just look at it as a way of reducing suffering, you know, for people today in one lifetime. And yet there's a whole nother aspect of Buddhism to America, though, which is Asian Buddhism, immigrant Asian Buddhism. So as the Japanese and Chinese immigrants come into the United States in the 1800s, Japan and China begin sending priests over to kind of maintain their traditions. And you have Korean traditions, and you have Vietnamese traditions, and Cambodian and Laotian traditions now in the United States. And this Buddhism is different in many ways than the convert Buddhism. And there are many more Asian Buddhists, Asian birthright Buddhists than there are, say, Western convert Buddhists right now. So when you talk about Buddhism in America, we really ought to be talking about this much larger group, which is a group that's maintaining its own ethnic understanding of the religion as it's been practiced for maybe 1,000 years in the countries that they come from. So I mean, Buddhism is very pluralistic. Is also pluralistic in the United States. There's Asian Buddhism within convert Buddhism. There's Zen. There's Tibetan Buddhism. There's insight meditation. There are all these different schools. There's the mindfulness movement. So I mean, it's a very diverse phenomenon right now. I don't think you can sum it up in any kind of simple way.
That's great. I'm tempted to dwell on this subject just for a minute. Would you say you, as a Zen priest, identify more with this modernist version of Buddhism, or are there some aspects of the ancient practice of this tradition that you think are of such value that they can be preserved even if they challenge some of our modern assumptions? Or where do you come down on these
Well,
questions?
I have a lot of disagreements with what I might call mainstream traditional historic Buddhism. Okay, and some are that I am raised as a scientist. I'm a empiricist. I am a naturalist. I find a lot tremendously useful for me, but there's a lot that I have to look at as metaphor in some kind of way rather than as being strictly true. And I also disagree with the goals of Buddhism in some way. So if the goal of Buddhism traditionally is to not have any desires or not have any attachments, I don't agree with that as a goal. I believe in moderation in desires and wise attachment, but I think attachments add a great deal to our lives. So I have a lot of quarrels, okay, with the Buddhist tradition. On the other hand, there's a lot that I like, including some of the traditional things. I mean, I wear robes. I like the smell of incense. I like bowing. I like the bells. I love keeping the Japanese form of. Sometimes we chant in Japanese and so forth. So there's a lot there that I find very, very beautiful, and I think it expresses a great deal for me. And then lastly, there are aspects about. I was in a dialogue with the Secular Buddhist Network for a while about why I don't call myself a secular Buddhist. There's a whole group called secular Buddhists that have jettisoned every religious aspect. And for me, I mean, I've had experiences on meditation retreats where I experienced the sacredness of all creation and all being, and this kind of universal love that suffuses the universe. And it doesn't fit in with my usual scientific way of thinking about the world. So I have these experiences. They've been meaningful to me in terms of how I live my life. I don't know how to understand them in any kind of naturalized kind of way. And yet they open up a door to the religious that I want to maintain. I don't want to jettison that off. I should add that I worked as a chaplain in a hospital for a number of years. And I worked mostly with non-Buddhists, although I was there as a Buddhist priest and a chaplain. And so it meant I was talking with 90-year-old people who'd been part of the Great Migration North from the South, who grew up on farms in Georgia and stuff, and grew up within the Baptist Church. I'm working with all kinds of people from all kinds of backgrounds. And I found that it was always fun. When they talked about their religious experience and what was meaningful for them in their lives, I found ways that I could translate what they were saying into my own understanding of things. And I found we were able to communicate back and forth in a very meaningful way. So when Paul Tillich or someone like that talks about the ground of being or ultimate concerns and stuff, and he talks about God in that kind of way, I can relate to that. So although in many ways I'm kind of an agnostic about things, there are ways I can understand how people talk about God, or when people talk about the Jesus within them, for example, that Jesus lives within them and that they can talk with him. I understand that. In Buddhism, we talk about Buddha nature. And I think there's something very similar about those kinds of experiences.
Yeah. That inter-religious, inter-spiritual dialogue is, I think, an urgent necessity and can be so valuable, particularly when we do value pluralism. We can still remain committed to our traditions, but also engage in dialogue with others to learn more about their beliefs, but hopefully also more about our own as a result of the contrast. Mm-hmm. All right, well, let's get more into your book here, and we might circle back around to this question of the agnosticism about certain metaphysical claims, whether in Buddhism or any other religion. So in your preface to The House We Live In, you identify yourself as a Deweyan, that is, as a student of John Dewey, the American pragmatist and champion of democracy. And you reference Dewey's work just before sounding a note of caution to, say, leftist revolutionaries who might want to really totally upend existing structures and institutions to bring forth a more just society. And you say, I quote, "I don't believe in the possibility of radical change. right? But rather in something more like a gradual process of collective social inquiry, which is a Deweyan phrase there. Can you unpack this for us? Why don't you believe in that kind of radical change? And what is collective social inquiry?
Well, Dewey had a very interesting view on all this. I might add, there's an interesting story about him that he went to China right after World War One. He stayed for about 2 years, and they called him the second Confucius when he arrived. And he talked about his gradual approach to social change there. And then about 6 months after Bertrand Russell came, and at that point Russell was a devout Marxist, and they called him the second Confucius when he arrived too. And the people who were later going to develop into the Chinese Communist Party, they found Russell much more persuasive than Dewey, and it may be that Russell had more of an effect on Chinese society than Dewey did. But Dewey thought that, you look at all the norms and values that we've inherited just by learning at our parents' feet and in their school system and through the media and so forth. We have a whole bunch of things that are basically unexplored. We just accept them as kind of tacit assumptions about our expectations about things. And that the only things we really change are the things that become problems for us. If we have these assumptions and they seem to be working fine, we never question them. We don't inquire into them. So Dewey was saying, well, sometimes problems arise and you need to focus on those. And you can come up with maybe a better way of doing those. And you can ask, is this still valuable today? Or was it ever really valuable? Or do we have to make some changes? So you come up with some solution to it. But I would want to say that every solution creates new problems. And the idea that you're going to somehow get to a utopia through this process of forever revising again things isn't true. We can talk about some things that have improved over the last 2,000 years, better medicine, better technology, longer lifespan, higher standard of living, and so forth. But in other ways, if you look at intergroup conflict and oppression and hierarchies of status and so forth, nothing has really changed much over the last couple of thousand years, as far as I can see. You look at Russian history from Ivan IV through to Putin, or you look at Chinese history from the Han Dynasty down to Xi Jinping, and you just have, you can't say there's been steady improvement throughout history. It's been pretty remarkable the last 200 years. We had the end to slavery, we had women's suffrage, we've had some major changes, but all of those took time. None of them are complete yet. Okay. So every movement that we looked at takes 50, 75, 100 years to reach some kind of initial fruition. And then, even then, we can say women get the vote in 1920, but the sexes are still not equal anywhere in the world, right? Or we can say, well, slaves were freed in the 1860s, but there's no real equality between blacks and whites in this country today. So this is a kind of a slow evolutionary process that takes constant inquiry and constant looking at and constant questioning. And when there's a problem that we can see, then the whole society gets involved in a discussion, whether it's in the media or in social groups or around the Thanksgiving table. Everyone begins discussing, what do you think of this? And it may take 25 or 30 or 40 or 50 years before there's finally a new consensus on how things ought to be, but it occurs through this kind of lively interaction. I think one of the problems we have today is that the venues for what we call social capital, the kind of groups where people meet face to face and form lasting friendships and get involved in mutual tasks that are humanitarian tasks, those are disappearing in a remarkable way. You think about the old Rotary clubs and the Key clubs and the Elks and the Moose and the Veterans of Foreign Wars and Hadassah, all these different groups where people would, the Shriners and so forth. They might do some good for the community in various ways. People would meet and interact and talk about things. They'd have speakers come and talk about topics. Those venues are disappearing, being replaced by virtual ones. And we have no idea what that really means for this kind of project of mutual inquiry into things. We just notice that it's changing.
Yeah. Well, can you speak a little bit more just to the danger of moving too quickly? What is the risk there? Why not push harder, faster for deeper change all at once?
Well, first of all, Marx back in the 18 whatever it was said that everything that's solid melts into air. He was already noticing the rapidity of change at that point. as technology changes faster and faster and faster, it changes the social structure in ways that are just one could never predict, to begin with. So, and there's a question about how much change we can really tolerate. I mean, part of the problem we have right now in a society is we have groups that want to question almost every aspect of the society, and other groups who want to just live the way they've lived since time immemorial, as far as they're concerned. And whenever there's this kind of new way of looking at things and an old way of resisting it, it takes a long time for society to work its way through this. It's not something that you can change right away. So I think you always have to start from exactly where you are, okay, and make small changes and incremental changes. And then those changes lead to other changes, which are unforeseen and unpredictable. So I wrote in the piece, for example, that people talk about the abolition or overthrow of capitalism. Well, that's not what happened to feudalism and mercantilism. No one overthrew them. They just gradually changed into something else because 10,000 things are happening elsewhere. And that's what's going to happen to capitalism. It's going to gradually change into something else. We don't know what. And we can think about small changes we might make, making the tax system more progressive, or limiting the salaries that CEOs can earn, or adding unions to the boards of corporations, or saying that corporations have duties to their stakeholders and not just their shareholders. There are all kinds of changes we can imagine, but we don't really know where they're going to lead in the long run, or what's going to happen over 100, 200 years.
Right. I mean, the issue seems to be that even if we have this moral clarity about the sort of world we wish were real, we have these moral ideals that we'd like to realize. In terms of translating those ideals into workable policies and shifts in institutional structures, we can't predict what the effects will be of certain changes because of we just have to be epistemologically humble about the extent to which we know what the effects of our actions will be, even if the ideals driving our actions are moral, let's say. I mean, we could disagree about what is moral and what is not, but even if there are the best of intentions, it seems like what you're suggesting is that the consequences of acting on those ideals are difficult to predict and could end up making things worse, in the sense that they undermine structures which have existed for hundreds or thousands of years, and that there could actually be more chaos unleashed by removing these structures than gradually changing them.
I don't even think you can remove them. That's the point. I think that. So when I look at all the changes that I document a little bit in the book, say the women gaining the right to vote, how did that occur? Okay, so you have Seneca Falls, and you have a group of suffragettes and people who are very zealous for women getting equal rights, but there's a small portion of the population. In fact, the women's movement almost falls apart in the 1840s over the issue of divorce, because one group thinks that women should be able to divorce husbands for any reason, and the other groups thinks that would be terrible. If even the feminists were against that back at that point. Okay, as you get the vote, but women get the right to vote locally, in one state after another, in one election after another. It happens in one country after another, but it doesn't become national until 1920, let's say. And there had to be a lot of obstacles to overcome in the way. For example, one group that opposed women getting the vote was the liquor lobby, because they're afraid if women got in, the temperance movement was big then, that they'd abolish the ability to drink in the country once they took power. And in fact, that's what happened. I mean, 1920, they get the vote, and then there's the Volstead Act, and we have the era of prohibition. But it took a while for the liquor lobby to get a little bit weaker, before women could get the right to vote. Or if you look at, I talk about how the British ended the slave trade and all the factors that entered into it. So you needed the technological revolution where England, for example, becomes a textile powerhouse because of the invention of the steam engine and power looms and all sorts of things like that. And now Britain isn't so dependent on the sugar and rum and slave trade as part of its economy at that point. They can imagine doing away with slavery. And then there's the Napoleonic Wars, and most of the slaves are being sold to French colonies. And so that becomes a factor. And then there are Irishmen who admitted to as members of parliament. And the Irish are very sympathetic to the plight of Black people. So they vote differently. And so you have a situation where in the 1700s, you can't pass a bill to abolish slavery. you have all these changes that occur over 20, 30 years, and now all of a sudden it becomes easy to do it. It becomes so, but you couldn't have predicted those changes beforehand. Nobody would have predicted the growth of the textile industry or the admission of the Irish to the Parliament or the Napoleonic Wars and all the things that eventually make it possible to do what they did. So, and there were people who were, the Quakers were very much in favor of the abolition of slavery, but they were a minority at that point. But then they were also able to mobilize public opinion. There were now printing presses and all kinds of groups where they could go and speak, and they could put posters and sell pamphlets, and they could use mass communications to create a movement. This is the first time that's ever happened in the history of humankind, that you had these kinds of mass communications that made it possible. So I guess change is dependent on so many things, and just wanting to do something isn't enough to make it happen. So Woodrow Wilson is the first American president who suggested national health care, for example. Look how long it took to get to Medicare, and then from that to Obamacare. And we're still not done with the process. We're still in the early stages of it. It takes a long time to get things done.
In this country, especially, because we are so plural. I mean, we're so diverse.
Yeah, but I think that's true in every country. I mean, if we could talk about change in China as well, and what did that take?
Sure. I mean, on that particular issue of healthcare, though, it seems like many of the European democracies are far ahead of the U.S. On that particular issue.
All of them are.
So, speaking of pluralism, I wonder if you can unpack more what this term means, right? Because it's not just a de facto social reality that we live in a plural society, multicultural society, but it's also, I think, in your view, an active value that we ought to cultivate. And I think here of Dewey's statement, which you quote in your book, when he's talking about a democratic, pluralistic way of life, he says that this means responding to difference, not only as a right that other persons have, but as a means of enriching ourselves. Right. Yeah. So talk to us about pluralism, and not just as a de facto, just not just as a fact, but as a value.
Well, I want to start even before Dewey not before Dewey, but I want to start with Isaiah Berlin and his famous essay on 2 types of freedom, where he talks about the fact that there isn't agreement among people about what the best way to live is. I mean, the Amish have a different sense than the Hasidim do, and tech people in Silicon Valley have a different view of the good life than farmers in Kentucky do, and so forth. So Isaiah Berlin says that all the values that we aspire to in life, they don't form one whole unity. They involve being rich and being healthy and being kind and being brilliant and being skillful on a dance floor and whatever else you might value in your life. Okay, they don't form some whole. You have to make trade-offs, as we do. We talk about work-life balance. There are all kinds of balances we have to strive for, and different people will form different opinions about what that right balance is. Okay, is equality more important, or is freedom more important? We can argue that one forever. People disagree on it, and Berlin says there's no way to reach any kind of unanimity on that, and that his definition of liberalism, the liberal ideal, is letting other people live their lives with as much freedom as they can to do it according to their own lights and their own understanding of what's the good life, and letting that happen as long as whatever they're doing, it doesn't cause intolerable harm to other people. Okay, so if the Amish want to not drive motor cars and live in a community in which they drive horses and buggies, for example, it doesn't really harm anyone all that much. Let them do it, as long as they're not insisting that we all give up, horses and motor cars. They're not making any demands on us. They're saying just let us live the way we want to live. And that's the whole idea of what liberalism is: letting people decide for themselves what they think the good life is and letting them pursue it. And they may be right or they may be mistaken, but they have that freedom to do that. And whenever you try to kind of legislate, there's only one way to live, and everyone has to follow it. You're creating that's what the Christian ethno-nationalists would want to do. For example, the evangelicals right now, they want to create a society where everyone has to follow what they consider to be the biblical laws, or that's what Islamicists want to do. They want everyone to follow Sharia. We've decided in our wisdom we're not going to do that. We're going to let everybody live their own lives, okay, within certain limits. And I think that's a fantastic experiment. Okay, Um, and we've learned in this country to learn to celebrate diversity, not just tolerate it. Okay, we like the idea that we can go visit the Amish country and look at their barns and their hex signs on their barns and so forth. Or we like the idea that we eat tacos and burritos and sushi and Greek food and bagels and you name it. We can listen to jazz and we can listen to classical music and we listen to Afro pop and salsa, and I mean this is a wonderful source of creativity when cultures meet and they mix and they share ideas and so forth. It's one of the things that makes us a wonderful place to live right now in this era. So yes, I think it's more than just something we tolerate. It's something that we celebrate. And the fact is that no one person does have the secret about how things ought to evolve. And it's only through constant communication and discussion that we can share ideas and learn from each other and maybe come up with some better ideas.
Right.
Dewey would say better ideas for now, because eventually those better ideas will also need to be improved.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so you talk about in your book this pursuit of a consensus on the most important virtues, the most important values, a new consensus. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about, you give some lists of the virtues that Aristotle's virtues, Confucius's virtues, and so on. What are the most important virtues, and can you give us any advice about how to best avoid the inevitable conflicts that arise when these virtues conflict with each other?
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure. Well, first of all, I think this is a virtue ethics position, which says, first of all, that there is something called human flourishing, which is better than just survival or living. That there are better ways to live that really enrich living and being in an enormous way. And the virtues are things that either are conducive to human flourishing, or that partially constitute human flourishing. Okay, so what I want to say is that each of the virtues that I list in the book has a relationship to the possibility of flourishing for both people and for societies. And so when I talk about virtues, I'm talking about what I call constellations of habit and value that are both self-regarding, they help us, and other-regarding, they take other people's concerns into consideration. And they lead to better life for both us and for the people around us. So we can talk about things like benevolence and truthfulness, for example, as things that lead to both a better life for ourselves and a better life for the community as a whole. Or we can talk about equanimity and justice as things that contribute both to a good life for ourselves and to the community as a whole. Or conscientiousness. I make a list of virtues, and I don't claim it's an exhaustive list or a complete list, but I just wanted to demonstrate that the things that we call virtues are virtues for a reason, and that we can judge whether they are virtues or not by an empirical question of how much do they actually lead to greater flourishing or not. But everything hinges on some vision I have, which I put into one of the last chapters of the book, on what is flourishing for us today. And I don't want to say that flourishing is the same for every society in every historical era. You can talk about hunter-gatherer societies or honor societies or warrior societies where a different set of values may be important for the society to succeed. But if talking about the kind of industrial cultures of late modernity, so we're talking about the Western nations, we're talking about the developed nations like China and Korea and Japan, Taiwan, Vietnam. We're talking about some of the developing countries like Brazil and India and so forth. So I'm not just talking about, I don't want to say I'm just saying Western culture, but for these modern cultures, or largely modern cultures, or modernizing cultures, I think there are certain features that when I talk about what's flourishing for me, what do I want what kind of lives do I want my children to have? What kind of lives do I wish my friends would have, for their well-being? I think there are a list of things that make sense, and so one of those. So I have a long list there of factors that go into flourishing, but one of them is the quality of relationships. We want to be embedded in a network of relationships in which we love the people who are part of a network and that they love us and care about us in return. We want to have some sense of accomplishment in our lives. It doesn't mean necessarily accomplishment in terms of what society values, but in terms of what we value. We want to feel that there are things we're capable of doing that make us feel like we're capable human beings and have some power in the world to either make things beautiful or make things successful and so forth. We want to be able to appreciate aesthetics. We want to be able to appreciate a sunset and the taste of chocolate and the sound of the waves at the beach and look at flowers and butterflies. But we also want to have some artistic creativity ourselves. And most people will do that in one way or another, whether it's growing plants or doing quilting or writing poetry or drawing or whatever it is that people learning how to dance, learning how to sing, being part of a chorus. Most people have some kind of aesthetic endeavors that enrich the quality of their lives in some important ways. And then I also talk about what I call wholeheartedness, which is that we approach life in a very open and intimate kind of way. We're in for the whole 9 yards, the whole ride, all the joys and the sorrows. We embrace them and we affirm them, and we're not hiding somewhere for safety, but we're out there engaging in the world in an adventurous and open and loving kind of way. So I think that wholeheartedness, which is something I get from my Zen practice, is I think an important part. And I talk about some ability to accept things when they don't go our way, that when things don't turn out the way we hope they would, we don't get destroyed and devastated by it. We mourn it, we grieve it, we're wounded maybe by it, but we find some way to move on in life and still have life be meaningful. And then I have the dimension of meaning, that we have to feel like our lives are some part of a larger story of the future or of our society or our family. We have to feel that people that we care about in some way are better off because we've been here in the world with them. That's what meaning means for me. So those are just some of the things that I think go into what we call flourishing. And I think the virtues, being courageous or being benevolent or being truthful or being just and fair, I think those all contribute both to the quality of life we have and the quality of our relationships with others and the willingness of others to work together with us and cooperate with us. But I think they're also part of what we mean by being a good person. When we think about what is a person who's really reached the highest level of human development, what are they like? We would say they have goodwill towards other people. Okay, they're compassionate, they're kind in some kind of way, that they try to be fair. I mean, these are all not only things that lead to a higher level of being, but they're also part of what constitutes a higher level of being.
Yeah. At one point, you've been listing these different virtues, and at one point in your book, you distinguish between a kind of list of virtues and a theory of virtue or a theory of moral value. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you think we can have a widely accepted sense of moral value without a theory of value or a metaphysics of value, where what is of value and what is virtuous somehow rests on ultimately some kind of spiritual affirmation. Or on the other hand, maybe we don't need a theory of moral value to live a virtuous life. What do you think about that?
I think you have to have. I mean, to me, this is. It's interesting to what degree is this empirical and to what degree is it theory. Okay, I mean, I would like to say that all of the things that I've mentioned are things that we could actually empirically verify in some kind of way. That people who lead these kinds of lives, who have these kind of virtues, actually are happier. Okay, and the people around them are happier, and they live in a more harmonious way with other people, and they feel their lives are more meaningful and more fulfilling. And other people would look at them and say, "That's a good person." I think there is a way in which a lot of this is somewhat empirical, and I think even this vision I have of what flourishing might be is kind of an empirical one. I didn't start off with a theory about it, but I kind of just looking at what are the things that contribute to my life and to other people's lives, and what are the things that really matter, and what are the things that make life good for people.
So, I mean, to give a specific example, something like human rights, let's say, the rights that individuals have to hold their own values and so long as they don't negatively affect those around them. This sense of human rights, some have argued, can be established and protected and defended just based on the idea that, look, we came up with these institutions that want to protect this rights and this right, and there's some kind of empirical basis and consensus for that. And others would say, well, the reason that individual human rights are so important is that there's something about the human soul or spirit that is created in the image of God, or from the Buddhist perspective, there's a Buddha nature, there's a potentiality for enlightenment in every sentient being, including human beings. And Buddhists traditionally would say that the human is a very auspicious incarnation because of this potentiality to awaken, right? And so, on the one hand, there are these things that we reach for, which have a kind of metaphysical or spiritual basis that justify the value of human rights. And then there are people who want to take a more empirical or secular approach and say, well, there's no ultimate reason for this other than the fact that enough of us have gotten together and formed institutions that want to protect these rights, right? And so are you more on that side, or do you think that ultimately there has to be some metaphysical basis here?
Okay, so this is a complex question. and I don't want to, first of all, I mean, these ideas that we have about personal rights or personal worth, that everybody is worth something, that everyone has equal existential worth or something like that. These are ideas that not just come out of the blue, okay? They grew out of traditions, religious traditions that were already present. And I think that our religious traditions contain all kinds of metaphors and stories and are part of the wisdom of a culture that we can lean on to kind of develop. So I don't want to shortchange how these grew out of religious traditions, or how they grew out of philosophical traditions and have their roots there and still do have their roots there. On the other hand, for me, I tend to look at it more empirically. And I say, well, let's look at societies in which people are given a good deal of freedom to make their choices about who they marry and where they work and what their religion is going to be or what their sexual orientation is going to be. And they get to kind of declare that for themselves and speak with their own voice. And let's look at societies where that's squashed in some kind of way, where people are told essentially what to do. And where would you rather live? Where do people want to immigrate to? Where do people vote with their feet to be? And I think, for me, the lesson of history is that societies that allow a reasonable amount of that are much more desirable places to be than ones which don't allow you to make any choices in your life. And you just have to follow lockstep, whatever the tradition or the rule is, or whatever the ruling class thinks you ought to do. I think there's an empirical side to it. I mean, even if the religious tradition said this is the right way to go, but there was empiricism that suggested that it wasn't a great way to go, that people had freedom, the societies became very disordered, and there was chaos and anarchy, and it was a kind of a Hobbesian kind of situation of every man against every man fighting, and life was nasty, brutish, and short. Then we'd have to say, well, those decisions are wrong, and we don't, even though they suggest this individual freedom, really doesn't work out well. I think it's really an empirical question whether it works out well, and I think it does. Of course, the Chinese always look at our culture and say we're a disaster because we're so chaotic in the way we do things. And then we look at the Chinese culture and say they're so regimented. We look at the current surveillance state that they have, and it's horrifying in many ways.
Right. So you draw a lot of lessons from Aristotle, Confucius, and Buddha in this book, each of whom lived, about 2.5 millennia ago. Why do you think their ethical teachings are still relevant to us today? And what would you say to those leftist revolutionaries or radical progressives who might want to cancel Aristotle for arguing that some people are natural born slaves, or cancel Confucius for affirming patriarchy, forbidding women participation in government, telling them to stay in the home, and so on? Why are these thinkers from the ancient world still of enduring importance, would you say?
Wonderful question. So I would say that 200 years from now, people will look at this conversation and say, how could they have ever believed that? I think that's just the nature of things. All of us, even the best and the brightest of us, get as many things wrong as we get right. Maybe more things wrong than we get right. I always love that story about the dean at the medical school who tells the graduating doctors that, you know, that half of the things we taught you in medical school are wrong, and the bad news is we don't know which half it is. So yes, I mean, Aristotle had terrible views about women. He had terrible views about slaves. And Confucianism is a very patriarchal system. He talks about the duties that sons have to fathers, for example, but doesn't talk about any duties of women to mothers, you know. And we talk about ways in which the Buddhist system is limited by its time and place as well. So we're all prisoners of our culture. We're all prisoners of our time, and maybe we can transcend what we're born into a tiny bit, but not too much. I think we have to approach people charitably. Okay, you know, we can say Woody Allen was a great filmmaker, and yes, he lived a life that we don't approve of, or Richard Wagner was a great composer, but he was a horrible person and an anti-Semite, or Thomas Jefferson came up with fantastic ideas about how a republic ought to function, and he was a slave owner. And maybe, given the age in which he started his relationships with his female slaves, maybe a pedophile too, in current thinking. Anyone you can pick, you know, you can find out what their flaws as human beings are. We can say that Martin Luther King was somebody who had a great influence in American culture and on the civil rights movement, but he was unfaithful to his wife, and he wasn't a very good husband in that way. We all are imperfect. So let's start from that premise that we can pick any philosopher we want and we can find out what they're wrong about. You know, when I started studying philosophy, the hope was I'd find the guy who had it right. Which philosopher has it right? Is it Nietzsche? Is it Hume? You know, who is it Heidegger? Who knows what's really going on? And the answer is that every philosopher gets a lot of things wrong, but that's not why we study them. We study them because they have some vision somewhere in there that enriches our life and allows us to think in a greater way about things than we ever thought before. They make us better thinkers and more critical thinkers, and allow us to imagine futures we couldn't have imagined, and selves we couldn't have imagined before. So when we're talking about the Buddha and Confucius and Aristotle, I want to say they were the greatest writers of their civilizations, limited by their times. We don't have to believe everything they say. And yet when I read the Nicomachean Ethics, you know, that's still one, I mean, it speaks to me today. I read it and I say, I'm agreeing with a lot of things in here, not everything. But boy, this really makes sense to me in some very important way. There is a better way to live. There is something called eudaimonia, or human flourishing, you know, and it does involve both moral and intellectual virtues in order to do it well. And it's something we learn through emulation and practice and so forth. And it's a lifelong development. I mean, I think, and the idea that practical wisdom has to mediate all the virtues, for example. He says a lot of things that I think are just absolutely terrific, you know. And I feel the same way when I'm reading Confucius. He says wonderful things. And the same thing well, obviously with the Buddhists, and some are Buddhist. So I think they all have something to offer. Not that we have to believe everything they say, or not that they're totally modern in any way, or not that we could just take them and implement them just the way they were implemented in their day. But they have a lot to teach us. They were brilliant. In the same way that Newton was brilliant, and the same way that Einstein was brilliant.
So I don't have you to myself for too much longer here. I want to open it up, but I do have a rather large question about contemporary American society, mm-hmm. and the ways that you feel our country is failing to flourish. Mm-hmm. You speak about the problem of individualism. You reference Charles Taylor, who I know some of our students are reading right now, his book, A Secular Age, or have read recently. He calls it the great disembedding, right? There's an epidemic of alienation, of narcissistic self-absorption fueled by social media addiction. There's a economic model run by for-profit corporations that doesn't seem to be particularly geared towards human flourishing or the flourishing of life on Earth. There's a U.S. foreign policy and a geopolitical environment that seems increasingly multipolar, and the U.S. is having some trouble accepting that new situation. How does virtue apply, and your understanding and application of virtue apply to this national crisis? I mean, our whole democracy is in crisis. We have an election coming up. It's quite shocking to see the polling numbers at the moment. Nobody knows what's going to happen, but it doesn't look particularly good. And so how do you hope that your work can influence this rather dire situation?
Okay. Well, I know the last chapter of the book is saying, well, if we could develop this shared set of values that I've suggested and have this view of human flourishing that we have, what would we be able to change if a majority of people could agree on this? And I give a whole list of things that I think we could change if we had a new moral perspective on what's really important, what makes life really well worth living, and what could we do. But I think what I want to take a step back. We were talking about Charles Taylor and the Great Disembedding and so forth. That one of the things I stress in the book is that the last 500 years of history in the West has been the development of individualism, and pretty much the way that Taylor describes it. And it's so embedded in our cultural DNA that it's almost impossible to think otherwise. We see ourselves as individuals. We have a political model that's based on the idea of the social contract, that somehow we all got together and voted to do this, but I don't remember anyone ever asking me whether I wanted to join it or not. And then there's this other view I see it in Aristotle when he says we are a zoon politikon, we're social animals. I see it in the Buddha when he talks about the interrelationship, the ecological view of the interrelationship of all things and how they interact together. And I see it most clearly in Confucius, where he talks about people as being members of societies and members of cultures and members of families before they are anything else. This is what you're born into. You're born into a family. You're born into culture. You're a part of it. And culture is something that we co-create together. It's not something that's just handed down to us, although partially it's that. But it's also something through our mutual interactions and discussions and the way we vote and the way we spend our money and the choices that we make in our lives. All of us together collectively kind of define what this new culture is going to be. I think if you go into the cultures within the sonographic sphere that are influenced by Confucianism, people there are much more likely to see themselves as members of families and not as individuals. And I can't tell you how profound this is. And you see it in some African nations too. I had a friend who was from a Yoruban prince, and he talked about the difference between the Yoruba and the Igbo, for example, and how they looked at whether they were individuals or members of a clan or a family. And my friend talked about how every morning when he woke up, his mother would sing him a song, which would give the whole history of the people. Your grandfather was this, and your father was this, and this is you, and this is what you're going to become, and this is what you're going to do for the community. And they would sing it at his birthdays, and they'd sing it at his wedding. It's a song they keep with you your entire life. They'll sing it at his funeral. And he says, if there was ever a day that he did something wrong, his mother wouldn't sing the song, and he knew he was in trouble. But there's that enculturation into a culture and a society and a family and a history that's very, very deep. And it's something that I think we're lacking. And I think we have to find some kind of middle way between our current individualistic society and the Chinese society, which is more about collective responsibility for each other. How we get there, I don't know. I think we just have to keep talking about it and saying, hey, we're all in this boat together. We're all on, this is planet Earth. We're all on this little planet together. Somehow it's not going to work unless we all cooperate in some kind of way. We may not make it past this century, the way we're going, if we keep on burning fossil fuels the way we're doing. We may not make it past a century if nuclear weapons proliferate, and if we can't accept the multipolar nature of the world we're living in. So I think we just have to keep on talking about that fact and maybe finding ways to kind of experience community. I mean, Martin Luther King's dream was the beloved community. How do we create that in whatever ways we can in the world today? I'm impressed by little things we do in my neighborhood, for example, my community. We have, for example, I live next to White Plains. There's the White Plains religious leaders, which I'm a member of, and people from clergy from all faith get together regularly and talk about projects they can work on together. I just came from a meeting with 400 clergy the other day. There were rabbis and ministers and priests and imams, and the opening prayers were from the Christian Bible and from the Quran. The closing one was a Jewish prayer. And this is right after October 7th. And we were all talking about how we're all here to protect each other. You know, Islamophobia and anti-Semitism are things that we can't tolerate, and we all have to have each other's backs. And there was a very strong feeling about that. It was a lovely feeling. I think we have to create situations where that can occur and people can genuinely experience that. Can we get there in time? I don't know. You know, as I said, social change is very slow. We don't have a lot of time to preserve the planet. We're not doing very well at it. I would say that history itself is a discouraging thing to look at. History doesn't give you a great deal of optimism and hope. But I think the only thing that gives me hope is that we all have to do whatever we can to talk to other people, to connect to other people, to give up. One of the things I talk about in the book is how to talk to people on the other side of the political divide, how to have conversations that don't end up as debates, but really end up as some kind of sharing, and with a sense of respect for each other as human beings. Because that's the biggest problem. It's not that we have different views, but it's just that we demonize people with different views and even wonder if they're human, you know? So, I mean, that's a constant effort and a constant work.
Yeah. This idea of the beloved community, Martin Luther King Jr. borrows from the American idealist friend of William James, Josiah Royce, who talked about loyalty a lot, and loyalty to lost causes. Even if it seems like a lost cause, we can still be loyal to it. And Royce would even talk about the idea of loyalty to loyalty itself, which kind of brings us out of our in-group loyalties to be loyal to others who we might not even understand, but we're loyal to the idea of loyalty. And just this, yeah.
One of the things I do talk about, I think a little bit in the book, is if you look at the whole of Chinese philosophy during the Warring States period, it all revolves around the question of who are you loyal to? Are you loyal just to your family and clan, or do you have a larger loyalty to the whole society as a whole? And every philosopher had a different opinion on that kind of question. But what came to me from thinking about that is that when you talk about what's our natural intuition about these sorts of things, I think that we have a kind of a fractured kind of intuition about it. We believe in loyalty to those close to us, our friends and family. Don't betray them, you know, stand up for them and so forth. Maybe our coworkers, you know, in a work situation. But when it comes to people of different races, different religions, or people who live on the other side of the earth, we have maybe another kind of idea that we owe justice to everybody, or we owe benevolence and goodwill towards everyone. But there's this kind of a split between them. And when times are scarce and hard, people tend to draw on the wagons, and it's just my group first. And the out group, well, they can fend for themselves. And then when times are plenty, then you can be more generous and say, well, I love everybody, you know. But there's a real fracture in our own understanding. What's the moral thing to do in this regard? Should we be universalistic, or should we be loyal just to our in-group? And then I think that's one area where I point out that the religions of the world have a major role to play. Because whether you're talking about whatever religion you're talking about, Christianity or Buddhism or whatever, there is a sense that one ought to have some kind of universalistic well-being, goodwill towards men and women in general, and not just to your in-group. You know, whether it's the story of the Good Samaritan, or whether it's other stories like that, or whether it's in the Old Testament telling some 24 times love the stranger. Okay, not love your neighbor, love the stranger. Because it says it because it's a hard thing to do. It doesn't come naturally to us. But I think the religions give us some bridge. These stories give us some bridge in which enable people to make that transition to a kind of a broader loyalty to the human race, or not just the human race, but to the whole ecosystem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, widening circles of identification, and you know, just as America is a work in progress and an ideal that hasn't been realized, I feel like the idea of the human being is similarly something that we continue to strive for, to really be able to meet one another as human beings, which doesn't require being totally disembedded from and free of our cultural inheritances, but that there's some core recognition that we're striving for that allows us to respect one another. I think your book contributes to this project, both for the United States, but for also the whole planet. So I thank you for writing it, Seth, and for engaging me in dialogue. So many other things I'd like to ask you, and we could talk for hours, but I want to open this up to our other participants here. So anyone who would like to chime in with a comment or a question, now's the time. Please raise your hand using I think it's easiest if you use the raise hand function on Zoom, which you can find in the reactions, if you push the reactions button, so I can see you. Maybe I'll stop spotlighting you and I, Seth.
Yeah, I just put us into gallery view too, so I could see everybody.
Yeah. There's Carol. Hi, Carol. There you go.
Hello, Matt. Yes, well, if no one else is going to raise their hand, I will step in here and raise my hand. Thank you so much for that presentation. And I want to thank you also for your calm presence. I love that you modeled such a calm presence. I think that's something we sorely need these days. And I do have a question, but before I get to the question, one more compliment. As I listen to you speaking of focusing on relationships and human flourishing, and there was one other positive thing, which I apparently don't feel calm enough to pull up. Wasn't well-being, but human flourishing, that sort of relationships, that sort of positive stuff. I really, as someone who would like to start a movement of philosophers writing as mothers and grandmothers, I hear you doing philosophy like a grandfather. I don't know if you are, but that's what I hear, and that's my compliment to you. All right, and my question is simply, rather than these Western terms of relationship, human flourishing, well, relationship, the way you worded it in a Western sense, not when you use the Buddhist reference, which I appreciated, and human flourishing and so forth, is there just one in your mind essential Buddhist dharma that the whole world needs now?
Well, I'm going to evade your question first. And I want to say that the virtue that I think we need the most now really comes from the Confucian system. It's the virtue that in Chinese, I'm not a good Chinese speaker. I'm a better Chinese reader than a speaker, but it's the virtue that's called Ren, or it's often translated as humaneness or human-heartedness. But for Confucius, and for Mencius also comes after him, that's the prime virtue. All the other virtues are secondary to it, and it's just having a warm heart. When Confucius is asked at one point, what is Ren? He says, love others. And when he's asked what is wisdom or Ju, he says, know others. Okay, but there's that intimacy that's and warm-heartedness or humaneness, that's the main virtue in Confucianism, and we see that too in Buddhism when compassion and loving kindness are two of the key virtues there. That's something that's lacking in Aristotle. I mean, Aristotle talks about philia or friendship, but he doesn't have the sense of communication or loving kindness that's directed towards everybody. So I think if I'm going to talk about Buddhism, I think the primacy of compassion, and then the sense of deep interconnection that Buddhists have, that we're not separate from the rest of creation, but that we're intimately connected in every way. We dependently arise with everything. We're affected by everything, and we affect everything. I think that kind of view about deep interdependence is maybe the most important thing that Buddhism stresses and teaches. If we could have that sense that every tree and every soldier fly and every beetle and every fish and every coral reef and every person, that we're all on this planet trying to make it together, and we're in danger of destroying that planet. I think that's the most important lesson that we have to, our deep independence is what we really have to appreciate more than anything else. How contingent we are on everyone else, and how everyone else is contingent on us. Because sometimes there's a feeling I'm just one person, I don't matter, but we do influence everyone around us.
Thank you. So like Thich Nhat Hanh's term interbeing, is that also?
Absolutely, it's the same. Yeah, technically in Sanskrit it's called shunyata, or emptiness, which is and also called dependent origination. But yes, I think Thich Nhat Hanh's word interbeing is perfect for that. We all inter-are.
Thank you, Carol. Thanks, Seth, for that answer. Just to let folks know, if you prefer not to be recorded, you can drop your question in the chat and I can read it for you. There's one there already, and I'll get to that in a moment. But I see Jingwen has her hand up. Please join us. Hi.
Hi guys. I thought you have visited some Buddha temple in United States. Could you please share your impression or your feeling or your comment when you visit those Buddha temple in US?
Yeah, could someone repeat the question for me, because I couldn't hear it.
Yeah, Jingwen was asking if you could share the feeling that you had when you visited Buddhist temples in the US. Is that what you're asking, Jingwen? Yeah. So I guess something about the sacred architecture, or I'm not sure what's in the question, but interpret it as you will.
Well, I've spent time in Korean temples and in Vietnamese temples and Chinese Pure Land temples. There's one very large one near us in Carmel, New York, which has the largest Buddha in North America in it. They're, and then I've certainly been in Zen, monasteries as well. To me, there's just a very peaceful feeling. There's the quiet in there. I just love being in a large space with a lot of people meditating. And to me, that's one of the best feelings in the world. There's a sense of, I want to say, wholesomeness and quiet, and it always puts me at ease, to be in these. I like the artwork too, the statues and the mandalas and everything else that you might have, the calligraphy, depending on which tradition you're in. I know I was trying to compare, years and years ago, I visited the Vatican and got a chance to see the Pope at that time deliver a mass in the Vatican. And I remember looking at Michelangelo's huge space and finding it wasn't, for me, it didn't speak to me in quite the same way that being in some small Buddhist center did. And I'm not sure why. I'm not sure why that's the case. But anyway, that's been my emotional reaction to being in those spaces.
Thank you.
So we have a question in the chat from Dominique, who asks, how has your clinical work as a psychotherapist influenced your spiritual life as a Buddhist, and vice versa? And for clarity, she asks what kind of psychotherapy you practiced.
Okay, well, I've been retired from psychotherapy for about 20 years now, so I can't talk a little bit. First of all, I consider myself an existential psychotherapist. So for me, psychotherapy was always meeting somebody in a very intimate and personal way, and co-discovering with them the possibilities of their life, where they may have felt that their life had stalled or shrunk in some kind of way, and helping them find possibilities to kind of restore their growth and their engagement and so on. So I always looked at it as a kind of an interpersonal adventure rather than a fixing of people. I gave up very early the idea that I could fix people, but there was something wonderful about being in the same space with someone and together, working together in some kind of way for them to discover what they needed to discover, not for me to teach it to them. So how does Buddhism affect it? There was a period of about 10 years when I ended up by default as being the person in my community that treated people with dissociative disorders. Many people didn't know how to treat them or what to do with them, and I was president at that point of the New England Society for the Treatment of Trauma and Dissociation. And so I ended up with the unfortunate situation of having a large number of very traumatized and very disturbed multiple personality patients. And the work was very unsettling for me all the time. And it was around the same time that I had done my internship with John Kabat-Zinn, and I discovered meditation. And I found that meditation really settled me down, that I could listen to the stories that people were telling. I could feel the tugs this way and that way within the relationship. And I could not necessarily react right away, but just be calm and allow things to percolate through me, before just kind of reacting in a kind of knee-jerk way. So I think the meditation helped me a great deal. And then I also wrote a book in 2003 that included a chapter on psychotherapy practice as Buddhist practice, where I took the different aspects of Buddhism and talked about how it related to psychotherapy. So certainly being able to really listen to people and hear them, rather than being in your head thinking all the time and trying to be one step ahead of people. I thought that was very important, to just become open and listen and to really hear what people were saying and to let it resonate with you and let it percolate inside. And I found that made me a much better therapist than when I actually was coming up with plans about what to do and strategies and so forth. So the less I thought, I think the better I became in an interesting way. It also meant keeping all the virtues, the moral virtues, being honest in therapy, not only honest with yourself, but honest with your insurance companies and so forth. I know a lot of people were kind of tweaking insurance plans to make it look good to insurers so that they could sell the psychotherapy to them and so forth. It meant we talk in Buddhism, we talk about speech that's right speech. So it meant that when you're talking with someone about something, that you only say something when it's useful to hear, and when it's not likely to do any harm, and when it's kindly spoken out of a kind of kindness and compassion, that you don't, otherwise you just don't say anything. So that was an important part of my practice too. I don't know if that's the short form of the answer. But I think it helped. A lot of other therapists have commented on this who've been Buddhist psychotherapists, that it helps the whole process of relationship in terms of the kind of being intimately present with the person in a way that's authentic. I mean, that's always been the goal of existential therapy, to be in the here and now with someone as a real human being, as two human beings together. And I think that Buddhism helped me with that.
Thank you, Seth. I don't see any other hands up at the moment. And just as a follow-up to what you've just been sharing about your former psychotherapeutic practice, I wonder if at this point, as a Buddhist, do you believe in the possibility of awakening, enlightenment, satori? Is this something that modern Buddhists can take seriously, fully, or do you have a different way of interpreting it, or how do you relate to that?
I think I have a different way of interpreting it. I don't think there's this final state that you reach in which you're 100% compassionate, 100% wise, have no more desires, are free of all suffering and so forth. And there's no more work to be done. I mean, that's the old model from Indian Buddhism, that there's this place that you reach. And I don't believe in that for 1 second. I think there's no transcendence out of the human condition. We're always stuck in the midst of it. That there's no end to suffering. I mean, old age and sickness and death come to all of us. And while we might be acceptant of it, or more acceptant than we are at first of it, it's still not a great deal of fun. to have cancer. It's not a great deal of fun to lose your wife to cancer. It's not a great deal of fun to have your children be consigned to a mental hospital. There's a lot of difficulty that comes with life, and we ought to recognize that. And the idea that somehow we're going to reach this state of great equanimity in which we're not pained by all these things, I think is nonsense. On the other hand, I think there is awakening. I think there is becoming more and more aware of our connection to other beings. There's a way in which compassion become more and more a default state for us and not just a rarity for us. There's a way in which we can make it our practice to see people who originally we might not want to have anything to do with and find some way to connect with them in a humane and human way. There's always a widening of a hearing of other people's perspectives and an understanding of it. It's interesting that I think being awakened has something to do with being woke now, which wasn't true maybe. You look at the great Japanese Zen masters who lived in the 1920s and 30s, they all supported the Japanese war effort. Okay, they didn't have any, we say, how could they do that? They had some kind of awakening and some kind of understanding, obviously from their years and years of effort, and yet it didn't include something as simple as that, I think we have to talk about awakening now as including an understanding of patriarchy and of sexism and of racism and the falsity of social status and the emptiness of acquisition and accumulation and competition and so forth, as opposed to some other ways of living. I think that's part of awakening now. But I think more and more it's just a matter of being more present, opening the heart, and there's always more that you can do. And are these great visions that come about, like William James writes about, for example, in the Varieties of Religious Experience? Yes, there are. But even those great awakenings are just our great awakening in this moment from our current perspective and our understanding now. We might have a bigger awakening 10 years from now. Hakuin, who is the great Rinzai Japanese Zen master back in the 1700s, he had 4 great awakenings, each one bigger than the one before it. And Dogen, who was the founder of the Soto school of Zen in Japan, he said that we had to go beyond Buddha. That each student has to surpass his teacher in understanding that that's the goal. He also said, and I love this phrase, he says, when one side is illuminated, the other side is dark. And I think that there's something true about that. When you see something very clearly and strikingly for the first time, you're not seeing the whole of it. If I'm having this wonderful moment of intimacy and boundlessness with the world around me, and I'm merging into the space around me, and I feel this oneness with everything, I'm at one with whatever happens to be right in front of me in my space right now. I'm not at one with whatever's happening in Alpha Centauri at that moment. It's just a partial view. So I think we ought to look at the fact that that awakening is a process. It's continuous. There's no end, and we can always see things from an even greater perspective and with more heart. So that's what I'll say.
Asymptotic enlightenment, perhaps.
Asymptotic.
Anyone else want to chime in with a question or a comment?
I see a hand.
Robert, let me make sure you're unmuted. There you go. Hi, Robert.
Okay. Well, so I've read various books by Thich Nhat Hanh, all of which I've loved. And then recently I read No Death, No Fear. And I found myself in a struggle, and perhaps you could help me and others who have read this book or will read it, that it was some of what it affirmed was so beautiful. He cried when his mother died, and he cried when Martin Luther King was assassinated. But then he made statements such as, don't cry if a boy dies, because he's here, and he's everywhere, and everyone is everywhere. And, I am the man who emulated, the man who emulated is me. And I started sort of losing my foundation. But I wanted more of a self that I was finding. And I was wondering if I misread or something. Anything you wanted to say on that subject would be very welcome.
Yeah, I don't think you misread. And if you're uncomfortable with that, I think that's okay. Okay, I'm old enough to have kind of stacked up a number of losses, you know. I mean, all of my family of aunts and uncles, grandparents, my parents, they're all gone. You know, some of my older cousins are gone now. My first wife passed away from cancer. I've had cancer. I have kidney disease. I have diabetes. You know, I just went to the doctor the other day and I had a PSA of 35. Maybe I'll have prostate cancer. You know, so all these are not things we want in life. I don't know how much longer I have. You know, when I wrote this book, I said, let me live long enough to finish it. Okay, that was my goal. I'd like to be able to finish this book before I go. And now I have other writing projects I'm on. I'd like to finish them too. I think it's all right to cry and to grieve and to go through whatever you need to go through, whatever feels right for you. And it's all right also to feel like the people who are gone are still here. I mean, I feel that way about my parents, that I can, you know, there are occasions in the Jewish calendar where you light a candle for your dead ones called the Yahrzeit. And I'll go to the grave, my first wife's grave, you know, with my daughter, and we'll plant flowers. And in each situation, I'll take about a half hour to talk to them, you know, what's happening in my life and, you know, what's happening with their great grandchildren and so forth. And it feels meaningful to me. And as a naturalist, I don't really believe in life after death. On the other hand, I find that very compelling and reassuring. And I guess it feels like a deep sense of connection that I have with them that still informs my life and I'm grateful for. However, even if I want to think of it as just psychological, it's still very rich for me. There's a Tibetan story. Marpa was one of the great yogic adepts in early Tibetan history. He's called Marpa the Translator because he translated a lot of Buddhist text into Tibetan. And the story is that there's a long story, but anyway, his son dies and the people see him crying. And the people come up to him and say, "Why are you crying, Marpa? Didn't you tell us that death is just an illusion?" And Marpa says, "Yeah, but it's the hardest illusion to dispel," he said. So I've always taken that as a kind of a marker. The other story I'll tell is of one of my early teachers, Larry Rosenberg at the Cambridge Insight Meditation Society, talked about being in Thailand and also being in Japan and talking to Buddhist masters in both countries about how they would deal with the death of a loved one. And the Thai teacher told him, "It wouldn't affect me at all if somebody died. Death is, you know, death is natural. It's part of life process. You know, I would be imperturbable. I would be in my usual place of calm and peace." The Japanese Zen master said, "I would tear my hair out for a year and scream and shout, and then I'd get over it, you know." And so Larry just asked the question, which of those is the real Buddhism, you know? So anyway, I vote for scream and cry and tear your hair out for a year. But also, I believe in the value of loss endures. It's not like it goes away, but it can be transformed into meaningful ways. And I'll tell you two stories about that. One was a patient of mine whose young son died. And he came to me to tell me about this. And he said that he was totally bereft. And he says, "I can't feel my son is anywhere. You know, it's like he's totally torn from me." I said, "Don't you have any feeling that he might be up in heaven or something?" No, it's like I'm cut off from the most meaningful part of my life. And over the course of a year in therapy, he came to me at some point and he said, "That hole in my life," he says, "I feel like it's changing and it's become a tunnel. And I feel like I can communicate through that hole, you know, to my son now." And he had a feeling of being restored to that relationship somehow. I have no idea how that happened. Okay, but it happened for him. And when he had that, he felt he could leave therapy at that point. He had accomplished what he wanted to. The other story is about another patient I had who had probably the most god-awful childhood I've ever heard of. Okay. And there was just this enormous well of sadness in her life about this that felt like it was untouchable. She couldn't go there. And she engaged in meditation practice, mindfulness practice, and eventually she found, and she writes about this in the diary, that she found she could be side by side with her sadness, right? And not push it. She'd have to drink and drug and cut herself or commit suicide, that type of suicide. She didn't have to immerse herself in it, but she could sit side by side with it, and that it wasn't necessarily a bad thing in her life. And she had this view of her sadness as being this barren crater in the earth. And when she would meditate around, she'd just sit by this barren crater where nothing lived, and that was her sadness. But over the course of a year, she said, it began to rain and the crater began to fill up with a little bit of water, and then insects would visit it, and there were some plants that began to grow, and eventually it became a garden for her. And I think that's a wonderful story of personal transformation, that what was once a source of just sadness now became a source of richness for her. And she became a very, for someone who had spent most of her life in mental hospitals and was living a very disordered life, she became a real asset to her community. She became a kind of volunteer, peer counselor for people with chronic mental illness, and became a speaker. She would go around, to various places and speak about her overcoming her mental health difficulties. And she was really an extraordinarily admirable person. This is somebody who had been hospitalized at age 20 and was diagnosed as a sociopath, but she wasn't. Allen Ginsberg said, never give up on anybody. I think there's a lot of truth in that. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
It more than answers my question. It gives me knowledge and insight, but more than that, it's a beautiful example of a compassionate response. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks for the question, Robert, and that response, Seth. I don't see any other questions, and I know you're 3 hours ahead of us, Seth, so I don't want to keep you longer than we need to, but I just thought I would end by sharing John Dewey's sense of natural piety, because I think it speaks quite profoundly to the sort of tenor of the wisdom you've been sharing with us. And Dewey refers to the community of causes and consequences in which we, together with those not born, are enmeshed. And he talks about the widest and deepest symbol of the mysterious totality of being that the imagination calls the universe. And Dewey has this wonderful naturalistic way of remaining open to this mystery and inviting us all to engage in collective social inquiry in response to it. And I think you've really demonstrated what that looks like for us tonight, Seth. So thank you. Is there anything you'd like to share with us as parting words?
Did you want to discuss metaphysics and cosmology?
Well, how much time do you have? We'll do a part 2 for that.
Okay.
I definitely would love to pick your brain and heart about metaphysics. But at the end of the day, a Buddha, Gautama Buddha is one of my favorite lines from his original teachings. Had to do with students asking these metaphysical questions, and he said, "Look, you've been shot with an arrow, and don't you want to deal with that problem before you get the answers to all these abstract questions?" Mm-hmm. And so the question of suffering and the alleviation of suffering, I think, is one which, when we engage in democratic forms of politics and in a pluralistic society, that's the North Star. How do we alleviate suffering? Mm-hmm. And then when suffering does seem to be being held at bay more or less for as many people as possible, then yeah, we can explore metaphysical questions. And I ultimately do think they are relevant, but it's good to keep our priorities straight. Yeah. So we'll have to postpone that conversation, Seth.
Okay, we will.
Yeah. All right. Thanks everyone for your attention, and thanks again, Seth. This was a lot of fun for me. I learned a lot, and I hope those who watch this in the future will appreciate it as well.
And Matt, it's delightful meeting you, cousin.
Yeah, likewise. Likewise, Seth.
Okay.
All right. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Right. Thanks, Matt.